story recapped here. Today I'm gonna explain a comedy, drama, and sci-fi movie called Visioneers. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The Jeffers Corporation is the largest, friendliest, and most profitable corporation. George Washington Winsterhammerman arrives to work at the level 3 Tunt and greets the portrait of the CEO, Mr. Jeffers, with his middle finger. His co-worker Cindy arrives, and they flip each other off as a form of greeting. When his co-worker Todd arrives, he immediately takes a gun to his head, pulls the trigger, then sighs. The trio continues with work as usual while an announcement counts down the minutes remaining before the weekend. Moments later, George receives a call from his workmate from level 4, Charisma. She notes that their co-worker Mike won't be coming in. After the call ends, Charisma sends him the day's workload, which comes in from a pneumatic tube. George opens the papers and sees that Charisma added a post-it with a smiley face, making him smile. Soon, Charisma calls again to report that their co-worker, Mike, exploded last night. Cindy and Todd are surprised and become intrigued when they find out that they're getting a new employee. Cindy notes that Mike didn't seem like the type to explode, though she isn't surprised because he was tired, and that's one of the signs. Todd then shares that his therapist suggested that he pull the trigger on his gun every hour to prevent himself from exploding. As they worry about exploding, George whistles to stop them from getting distracted. Suddenly, they receive a call from level 5, reminding them to maintain productivity as Jeffers commands. The trio gets back to work, ignoring the sound of a woman exploding nearby. The level 5 crew calls again to say that Jeffers thanks them for their productivity. Meanwhile, George's wife, Michelle, watches a show where TV host Sarah teaches her audience how to be happy. When George arrives, Michelle is still fixated on the TV. George checks on his son, Howard, but gets ignored again. Over dinner, Michelle talks about wanting the book from Sarah's show. Then, while in bed, Michelle recounts that their son wouldn't come out of his bedroom. George's brother called, and someone from his office said George didn't have to work the next day. Without responding, George turns the TV on while Michelle goes to sleep. While watching the news, George finds that the death toll of people who exploded has reached 100,000. According to the report, some of the victims suffered from dreams. George sees his doctor the next day. The doctor finds that he's obedient with average intelligence, which is good. However, his brain scans were negative, which complicates his diagnosis. Average men like him don't tend to suffer from dreams, but George has had dreams where he's his ancestor, George Washington. The doctor tells him that dreams can cause instability and explosions, so he reminds him that dreams are never real. George returns home to find tourists viewing his house while the guide notes that, unlike his ancestors, George chose an average calling. George ignores this and heads inside, where Michelle greets him, though it's only because she's following her book on how to be happy. Howard still doesn't respond to his parents, and after dinner, George watches TV with leftovers in his hand. He watches a CDC report about the symptoms of explosion, which include impotence, lack of sleep, and binge eating. This makes George switch channels before eating his leftovers. He then watches another channel and dreams of becoming the action star on the show. Later, he gets into bed with Michelle. Michelle wants some intimacy and brings out toys to spice things up. However, George isn't interested, so she apologizes and asks him not to explode. The following weekend, George calms himself by doing leisure activities. However, he still thinks about exploding before sleeping. A few days later, he presents the orientation video to their new co-worker. The video explains the Jeffers Company philosophy to forget about yourself and work your life away. No matter how tired they are, working together will provide jobs and happiness. The video includes a testimonial from the United States President, and he flips his middle finger as support for the corporation. While the others try to focus, the new recruit starts eating raw meat from a bag. Cindy raises her concerns to George, although George can't do anything since they don't have any other replacement. Hearing their whispers, the recruit proudly claims that they were allowed to eat when he was in level 2. However, he got imprisoned and recently got out. When he took the company test, he qualified for level 3. The revelation makes everyone uncomfortable, but they don't complain. Charisma then calls George to check on the recruit's performance and to get an update on George's medical exam. He assures her that everything is fine, though this doesn't wave off her worries. Charisma then sends him the workload for the day, which again includes a post-it note of a smile. As George drives later, he listens to a radio advertisement for a product promising an explosion-free life. When he arrives home, Michelle has invited missionaries, who tell him that the voices that tempt him to stray from society's path are Satan's work. Michelle points out that it's part of her book. He disregards them and goes to Howard's room. He tries to confront his son about ordering books about werewolves and stresses that reading them might stir up chaos. However, Howard ignores him as usual. Suddenly, George notices someone screaming and running around his lawn, and it's his brother Julian. Julian just quit his job in level 5 after dreaming about his nether regions being replaced by the Jeffers Corporation logo. Now, Julian is doing pole vaulting, free from stress. He enthusiastically declares that he's ready to live up to their family heritage, then invites himself to live in George's pool house. That night, George binges on ice cream and watches a show hosted by Burn Goodman, who wishes to raise awareness about exploding. He introduces a man named Joe, who supposedly has only 2 weeks left before exploding. Joe started to see the beauty in things, allowing him to survive. However, when Burn interviews him, Joe only lets out a few grunts. Still, George is impressed by this, so he attempts to look for beauty in a flower vase in his kitchen. Immediately, he gives up and shatters the whole thing. Later on, he goes to bed and dreams of becoming George Washington again. The next day, George receives a call from Cindy, announcing that she's replacing Charisma on level 4. She passively wonders if George is bothered that she'd been promoted over him, given that she's younger and a female. As Cindy rambles about their work relations and productivity, George stares blankly at the last post-it note from Charisma. Right after the call, Cindy sends the work for the day, but her post-it note only reminds George to be busy. Upon arriving home, George succumbs to the stress and binges on frozen food with his bare hands. However, he notices that Julianne is getting better at pole vaulting outside. When Julianne notices him, he playfully runs after George and play fights with him until George yells angrily. Julianne thinks George is finally getting the idea of freedom, but George just walks away. Later that night, Michelle keeps reading her book during dinner. Someone rings the doorbell, and it's Roger, a lifestyle coach that Michelle hired for George. Throughout their session, Roger acts arrogantly and touches George in questionable places. He makes George work out and gives him an uncomfortable massage. Despite being overwhelmed, George just takes it all without question. Soon, Roger asks him questions while George's face is stuck with a soothing cream. When Roger asks if he's happy, George nods, but Roger isn't convinced. Roger thinks George doesn't appreciate living in their great country, working in a great company, and having a wife who's able and willing. Roger stresses that George isn't trying hard enough and corners George into agreeing. Given the couple's struggles with intimacy, Roger insists that a man who doesn't want physical pleasure is not a man at all. Therefore, he urges George to get intimate with Michelle tonight. After Roger leaves, George finds Michelle already asleep. Still, he awkwardly touches her, but Michelle dreamily calls out Sarah's name. This stresses George out, so he attempts to binge but decides against it. Instead, he opens a package of happiness merchandise. He puts on the happiness hat, but it doesn't work, so he destroys it and begins screaming outside. He then throws a tantrum in a shed until he spots his old war model. The next morning, George finds 3 teddy bears at their office. The weird employee arrives in a scooter that's supposed to reduce stress and physical energy. Later on, Cindy sends Charisma's termination form to George, and Todd arrives. An announcement explains that the teddy bears are part of the new Cuddle Crew program for levels 2 and 3 to reduce the risk of explosions. The trio takes 1 stuffed toy each. The new worker seems pleased. George doesn't care much for it, but Todd seems overwhelmed. When Todd squeezes his bear's ear, it asks him if it's a wonderful day, and this causes Todd to explode. George slips into another dream where he's George Washington in the middle of a war. Todd reports their army's condition, so George decides to draw up legislation. As he writes, the recruit tells him they're losing the battle to the British, but George refuses to give up. When he's alone, however, George begins writing his surrender. Suddenly, Charisma arrives, shrouded in pure light, and George wakes up in his car. He comes home to Michelle watching Sarah's show again as they mourn those who exploded today. Michelle then walks away as the news reports of 300 victims of explosions, including Burn and Roger. The news shows footage of Burn's last moments, where he drunkenly ranted during his show and revealed that he spent his audience's donations on sinful things. Roger tried to calm him, but Burn pushed him off. Afterward, George watches as Julianne shows his pole vaulting skills to a group of people in his backyard. Julianne knows that he saw this moment in a dream, and now he has made it come true. As George goes to bed that night, he hears Charisma's voice. The next day, George copies Charisma's address from her termination papers, while the television promotes an emotion inhibitor that provides instant happiness. He drives to the address and arrives at a small cafe filled with books. He then spots a young waitress, and when she asks for his order, he recognizes her voice as Charisma's, who he's never seen face to face before. He points the menu to order, preventing Charisma from recognizing his voice. However, when he decides to leave, he excuses himself from newcomers, and Charisma hears his voice. They sit down to talk, meeting each other physically for the first time. As Charisma wonders why he visited, George is left speechless. Seeing the stress on his face, she asks how he is, and he finally shares that Todd exploded and that he dreamed about her. The two catch up until closing time. Before George leaves, Charisma confesses that she also has dreams about running away with him. However, she immediately apologizes for this because he's a married man. The following day, Jeffers and the president announced the mandatory use of the emotion inhibitor due to the extreme cases of explosions, and any employee exhibiting potential problematic behaviors would be immediately inhibited. When George returns home, he finds that his lawn is full of people living freely under Julianne's philosophy. He heads to the bedroom and finds his wife watching Sarah's show worriedly. As they reach the end of the book, it simply says that happiness is being happy. This frustrates both women as they don't understand what it means. As Sarah collapses in tears in her show, Michelle rests her head on George's shoulder and kisses him. This brings back intimacy between the couple. However, Michelle keeps talking about the book, so George pushes her aside as he loses the urge. George goes outside to talk to Julianne, who's isolating himself from the crowd. Julianne shares that the FBI intends to raid the place. Since the president announced the inhibitors, people reported their party as a political revolution. Julianne notes that those who reported them are doing the same, which is to entertain themselves but by different means. George then talks about his old model about Washington's army crossing Delaware. Washington claimed that he had a vision the night of the crossing, and George thinks it's similar to his dreams. George recounts that when he met Charisma, he thought about touching her hand but notes that it'd be like stepping into a pool of water. However, in the end, he didn't find answers when he met Charisma. Hearing this, Julianne simply kisses him on the head and leaves. For the next few days, George starts hallucinating about Jeffers, George Washington, the Bears, and Charisma. He's soon required to review the Bears while a level 5 employee named Mark keeps making annoying noises. Suddenly, Cindy calls to speak with Mark. Mark utters a few grunts before ending the call. A security guard arrives to forcefully put an inhibitor on the new employee. After some struggles, the new employee gets his inhibitor and starts acting jolly. Meanwhile, George proceeds to draw how he sees the future. Later, George stops at the crossroads towards Charisma's cafe as he listens to the radio program, which announces that they won't be playing music anymore. Instead, they read an announcement from the president that all those who feel like exploding should head to underdeveloped areas where they'll be met with inflatable castles, food, and bikini-clad women. George chooses not to visit Charisma and heads home instead. More people are joining Julianne's club, and now his property is full of happy strangers. George moves on and enters Howard's room, only to discover that he has left for good. Because of this, George watches the lively people outside and contemplates his life decisions. Later, he discovers that Sarah ended her own life. He checks on Michelle and finds her with a rifle in her hands. Michelle admits that she attempted to do the same as Sarah did, but she can't do it since there's nothing left in her. That's when she realized that the people who exploded were better than them, because they still felt something that wasn't ripped out by the product shoved into their faces. She then lets out her frustration about their marriage and slaps George. Despite the outburst, neither of them feels anything. Michelle heads to the kitchen to drink beer and recounts that she last felt alive when they met. Before that day, she was always drunk, and he swept her away with his good job and good family name. She then lashes out that meeting him ended up with her trying to kill herself. Finally, George allows himself to release his anger, and Michelle does the same. The two thrash their kitchen, throwing food and wrecking the place. When they've had enough, Michelle decides to end their marriage. Suddenly, the doorbell rings, and George finds Jeffers at his doorstep. Jeffers knows that he has focused his body and mind on not noticing anything he shouldn't be involved with. However, he doesn't see what the real Jeffers sees in George, revealing himself as just the front. As Jeffers stresses that they're at war with society, George can't help but watch as police officers capture the people outside his home. Jeffers then shares that they didn't think much of George until he drew a sunset on his Cuddle Crew review. Inside a limo parked outside, George meets the real old Jeffers, who is hidden from the world because his presence affected productivity. Old Jeffers notes that the war has already started because people began to think and question their way of life. However, George's drawing revealed that he's evolved to overcome emotions yet still be a willing cog in their machine. When asked why he drew it, George recalls thinking that dreams are dead. Old Jeffers promises that George can have peace while surviving the new world. Jeffers writes something on a card and gives it to George, telling him to follow the instructions to stop his pain and end his dreams. Later that night, George sees that Jeffers instructs him to kill the thing that he loves. As he contemplates this, George looks at his family's photos, seeing himself as a small, insignificant addition compared to his ancestors. He gets dressed and drives to Charisma's cafe. However, everyone there is brainwashed by the inhibitor, including Charisma. She doesn't remember him anymore, so George invites her on a boat ride. At the boat, George makes a last attempt to rekindle her spark by taking off Charisma's inhibitor. However, she still can't remember him. George realizes that there's nothing left, so he grabs a knife and approaches her. Suddenly, Charisma turns with tears in her eyes as she remembers him. With this, George immediately kisses her. The two begin getting intimate. The next day, George wakes up with Charisma sleeping beside him. Then, in the distance, he sees George Washington in a canoe, saluting him. George salutes back with fulfillment and a smile on his face.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.